All right. So remember yesterday's lesson, we were focused mostly on authentication, which is how a user proves to the server that they are who they say they are. So today we're going to be focused on authorization. That is, once a user has been authenticated, how do we determine what they're allowed to do, what they're authorized to do? So that's kind of step 2 of our, login authorization authentication process. So the primary way that we're going to limit who can do what is by using Django's built-in permission system. So before we talk about the permissions themselves, I'm going to create a couple models so that we have something that users can have permissions over. We're actually not going to interact with the models themselves too much. We're actually not going to touch the database a whole lot in this lesson, but we have to create at least a couple models in order for Django to make some permissions over them. So I want to build a blog again today. So we're going to have models for users, posts, and comments. And some of the permissions settings that I might try to implement today, saying that, editors, we're going to have different classes of users with different permissions. We'll say that editors can delete posts, moderators can delete comments, and other users should not be able to delete anything. Authorization, that's what we're learning about today. All right, so here I've got a kind of a template starter for a Django application. Should look similar to what I've been starting off with in previous days. So the project is called Permissions and Groups. URLs are all defined in the blog app. So in blog URLs, I've got a home page, sign up, log in, and log out. In the views, this code is mostly just copy and pasted from the previous lecture. Index is just going to render the home page, has the user's name embedded in there if they're logged in, got the basic sign up page, login page. So this should all look pretty familiar. Log out. And I've created a custom user model, app user. And in my settings, I've told Django that this is what I'm using for the user model. So instead of the built-in user, we're using this custom app user that inherits from the abstract user. Edgar, question?
Yes, so yesterday, after I created this app user and I did the auth, like to change like what the user is based off of in the settings, I couldn't create a super user from my terminal. It asked for my email and then it asked for password, and then I'd put those things and then it would say missing username, and it would just continue to do that.
Yeah, I ran into the same problem.
Same here, same problem.
Interesting. I wonder if you try adding a username as a required field, if you would then get prompted for it when you create super users in the Django admin. I'm not sure. I don't work with the Django admin too much, honestly.
Well, is there another way to create a super user, like from like app user or something? Like, I know we're going over permissions today, so I don't know if that has to do with it.
So why do you need to create a super user?
Well, mostly I was using it just to get into like the admin page and just like to see all the posts and to be able to like delete all of them and stuff like that. But I guess once you fully create the Crud app, you could just do everything through the website.
Yeah.
Right.
You can also use pSQL. That would be kind of my go-to, my first thought. If I want to know what's going on in my database, I would just look at my Postgres tables with pSQL. It would be cool if we could get the admin interface working. There should be a way to use a custom user model and still create admin users. So maybe I could look into that. Let me make a note real quick.
So I do have a note on that. It's definitely not the answer to the problem that you guys had, but just I did a lot of digging on the users yesterday.
Mhm.
And when you create the your specific user, like an app user, and you inherit, that's setting the user for the entire Django project. So your super user is just a one of whatever your base class user is. So if you inherit the app user and then change some of the functionality of it, then trying to create that super user, I don't know what the answer is, but I would imagine you would run into some issues with creating a super user, because the super user is just a type of user with additional permissions or whatever. So just a little note there.
So on that note, I just want to point out real quick, I just looked up a user in my database here. So again, this is just using the default fields from the abstract user. They have a field already. Where is it? Is super user, is false by default. But this is just kind of reinforcing what you were just saying, that the super users are not like a totally different model in the database. It's the exact same user model, just with this flag set to true.
So if we wanted to create like a super user, we would just set that to true, and then that user would be able to enter like the admin page.
I mean, in theory, yeah, I haven't tried it. I'm not sure if Django does other things behind the scenes when you like set someone to be a super user. But as far as I understand, like, yeah, that's the only thing that separates a regular user from a super user is that one field.
Yeah, the error I got was no username input. That was the biggest piece. And I thought it was because on line 12 here was because we set it to email.
That's probably related. There's probably some way that you can tell Django, in the Django like create super user interface that you need an email field instead of username. Or there might be a different way that I can configure this model to make it work in more different situations. I'm not exactly sure. So I appreciate that we're like experimenting with these things and tinkering with our code and seeing what else we can do with it. It's always good to explore like this. All right, I'm going to type up a couple other models, but feel free to ask some questions while I'm doing this. So like I was saying, we're going to have comments. Great. So in a larger, more fully featured application, there would probably be more information we would store on the comments, like who posted them. But it's not going to actually be relevant for this demo. Just for a second example, make a blog post. All right, so those look like some models. For a full application, these are actually kind of incomplete, but for today's demo, they'll be sufficient. So I'm going to make migrations now because I've changed my models. Wait, what the heck am I? So I created a new migration that adds the blog post and comment model. Now we're going to migrate. All right, so now let's take a quick look in the database and see what that actually did. So for one thing, like we might expect, I have these two new models, these two new tables in Postgres, blog post, blog comment, because it just concatenates the name of the app with the name of the table to create new tables. But there's a bunch of other tables here that have already existed that come from the built-in Django apps, like the built-in Auth app. So in particular, right now, I want to take a look at Auth Permission. So it's the permission table from the Auth app. This is just a list of all the things that someone could possibly do in this application. So I'm just going to select everything that's in there. All right, and so this is the contents of that table. It's got 32 rows, so it's kind of big, but you might notice some patterns here. Probably easier to tell if we go more towards the bottom of the list. But what's happening here is that for every model in the database, every model in our Django application, Django creates 4 records in this permissions table. So let's just look at, for example, for the app user table, that's just like our users for our application. We have these 4 permissions with IDs 21 through 24, can add user, change user, delete user, review user. So note that every permission has a name. This is like a human readable version. So if you need to print this out to a user to let them know, like these are the things you can do, you can print out the name of all their permissions so they can understand it. But from our code, when we're going to be accessing these permissions and like, writing if-else logic to determine what a user can do, we're going to refer to these permissions by their code name. And so for all of these code names, you might notice, so for one thing, there's 4 of them, 4 of these permissions for every model. Just want to point out that that corresponds to the Crud operations we learned in the past. So I'm just going to make a quick note about that. So these correspond to Crud, which we learned about before. Just kind of synonyms for the same operations, but it's the same 4 things: create, read, update, and delete. So also for blog posts, we've got the same 4 permissions: add, change, delete, view. Comments, Django created these same 4 permissions: add, change, delete, view. And then also for all of the built-in tables. So for the permissions table itself, you can give a user permission to change the permissions table for some kind of like super admin that is allowed to add and revoke privileges to other users. I showed you before, there's the session table in the database. You can give users permission to change those. I'm not exactly sure why you do that, but the point is just that every model in the database gets these 4 permissions. So yeah, these permissions by themselves don't really like do anything. They're just records in the database, but we can associate them with other users just so it's easy to look up, what permission objects are associated with this user object. So if we look at the list of tables in our database again, there's this other table here blog app user underscore user permissions. I'm going to take a look at this real quick. Excuse me. Okay, so this table is empty right now, but let's take a note of the structure of this table. So it's just got, it's an ID of its own. That's normal, whatever. But then the only two interesting properties it has are just two foreign keys. So it's got app user ID and permission ID. So this is a table that just connects a user to a permission. So just shout out if you know what this is for, but can anyone kind of guess why this table exists in the database, why Django creates this by default?
Is that to check what permissions certain users have?
Right. So the way that permissions are assigned to users is using the same kind of like database relationships that we've been learning about over the past couple of weeks. This table is just a join table that creates a many-to-many relationship between blog app users. Yeah, between blog app users and auth permission. Yeah. So right now, there's one user in the database, but I've not given them any permissions. By default, users have no permissions. So that's why this table is empty right now. And then the permissions table itself, where is it? Is just a list of all the possible permissions that someone could have in our application, but they haven't been assigned to anyone specific yet.
I have a good question, Raphael.
Let's hear it.
Are super users just people with all permissions set to true by default?
Almost. It's more that the Django permission system just won't check super users. Like, if you do any permission check on a user, the first thing it checks is, are they a super user? And then it just ignores the rest of the things it's supposed to check. If you're not a super user, then it actually checks if you have the permissions that are specifically requested. So I would say super users don't have all permissions, but super users don't need any permissions. It's kind of the same thing though. Because for them to have every permission, that would be a whole bunch of records in the blog app user permissions table, creating a many relationship between every super user and every permission. It's easier to just say that you don't need to check permissions for a super user. Okay, so what I want to do now is, so I'm going to update my sign up page so that it can allow a user to type in a role they want to sign up as. Normally, you'd have a little bit more security in your application. People can't just choose to be moderators or editors. But just to make this a quick, more basic demo, we're going to do things a slightly simpler way. So in our sign up form, going to add a couple more inputs. For the role, we're just going to let users type in if they are a moderator or an editor. Normally, you'd probably want to have a drop-down menu to let users choose the options. But just in the interest of time, we're going to let them type it in, choose their own role. Then we'll have to update the JavaScript that is sending this request. So in addition to the password, we're sending a role now. And I believe someone the other day was asking about why should I use forms when I'm sending requests with Axios. So you see here now, I added a third field to be added to the submission, and I just kind of hard coded in this third field here after this first two. If I had 100 fields that I need to submit, this would be really tedious and just take up a lot of space. So at some point, I would want to just grab the entire form at once and then convert that into a single object that I send up. But that's looking a little bit more further forward. Sukhdev?
Hi, Raphael. Sorry if I missed this, but was role one of the fields in the base user class, or did we put that in our extended abstract user?
It is in neither.
Okay.
Right now, all this is just a field on the sign-up form.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so now our front end is prepared to send the role that is typed in to the server. So let's see what our server can do with that. Okay, so we're already parsing the body when we get the sign-up request. So, we've got body email, body password. We should now have access to body role. Just take a look at that real quick. All right. But now if their role is, let's say, moderator, moderators should be able to delete comments. They have to spell it correctly. If you can't spell the word moderator correctly, you're not fit to be a moderator. So from here, we're going to add the permission to the user. And for the most part, we're going to interact with the permissions the same way we interact with any records in our database. Looks like I have to import permission. So I'm going to do that real quick. So the same way that we access any permission, any object from the database, you do model name.objects.get. And here we're going to select it by a code name. That's probably the easiest to remember and type correctly, because the actual name has like mixed case and there's spaces and stuff. But the code names I think are easier to remember. So this is commonly how people will search for permissions. So I want to get the delete comment permission. That's this one over here, should have ID 31. And then we add it to the user. Actually, So we've created the user. I actually have to fetch the user first so I can add things to them, because this creates someone in the database, but doesn't give us the actual user object immediately. Let's see. Okay, so that should get us the user. This fetches the permission. So really all we need to do with the permission is associated with the user in a many-to-many relationship. You know, we would add a record to the blog app user permission table that has the user ID and the permission ID. But Django has a slightly more helpful way for us to do that. We don't actually have to think about the join tables. We just have to think about the permission we want to add and who we want to add it to. And so we just call user.userpermissions.add and then give them the permission. I think Lyman, you had your hand up.
Got it up. I was just curious about handling permissions in the views. I know this is just probably just because it's simplicity. Is there like, I was just thinking like the best way, could you handle permissions in the actual model, or like, I was just curious about, I don't want to jump ahead of the gun too much. I just.
What do you mean the actual model? Like they
Well,
don't.
I'm just trying to
in the
think like,
user model.
I'm just trying to figure out in the Django way, like handling user permissions. So like if I sign up and I set my user permissions, you know, the best place for that logic. So I guess if you have a lot of different user permissions for different users, and but the functionality of that handling how users get attributed to certain groups or permissions that they get. That makes sense.
Kind of.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'd say that none of the information about user permissions is on the user model itself, but
Yeah.
it's all just relating it to other records in other models. John, do you have a question?
Yeah, for on the views part, whenever you're creating the create user, doesn't that return the object that it creates or the user that it creates? On line 23.
You know, it might, and that would be very convenient. Let's find out. So that would make a lot of sense. I don't think I've seen that before, but that would totally be reasonable if it worked that way. So I'm going to be optimistic and hope that this returns the user that it created so that I can just add this permission to them. So let's try to sign someone up and see if we can see the permission that they were given. Okay, so now we've got a third field in our form. We're going to sign up Tim Apple, Dragons, and he is a moderator. Looks like that did not work. All right, we're gonna do a little debugging real quick. Okay, so it looks like the role is not being included in the submission at all. It's not even in the raw body. So that's pretty telling. Oh yeah, and I can see from the client also that it's not sending it. So let's debug our JavaScript, see why that might be.
This is the kind of the same thing that we were trying to troubleshoot with Jesse's yesterday.
I hope not.
It's possible you just didn't save a document. I've been following along and mine's smooth.
It's not getting my updated JavaScript for some reason. Am I like going crazy here? So yeah, it's downloading the old version of my JavaScript file. I'm not sure why it's still caching the previous version. Oh, how did
Yeah,
that
I
unchecked?
was just gonna say that.
I swear to God, it's like the first thing I do when I get a new computer is I check this box and then I never look back to it. So I don't know how that happened. Okay, there we go. So now client-side JavaScript is actually using the updated version of this file. So let's try this again. Mallory is going to be our moderator. Prosperous Dragons, moderator. Okay, cool. So it looks like we were able to register. It redirected us to the home page.
Hey, Raphael, would you mind recapping what was wrong right there?
So the core issue was that I did not have this box checked, disable cache, while DevTools was open. So my browser was caching the JavaScript file, which is what it normally does, meaning that it thinks it's already downloaded that JavaScript file. So when I say, hey, download this again, the browser is going to say, like, I'm not going to waste bytes over the internet downloading a file I already have. I'm going to use the copy that I have locally. But my browser isn't quite smart enough to realize that the file has actually changed. So for development, I usually have this box checked so that my browser won't cache anything while DevTools is open. So I don't have to worry about that bug potentially happening, that every time the page loads, it's using the fresh version of my files. So yeah, not sure how that got unchecked there. But yeah, and so then this JavaScript was just using the old version that wasn't sending the role, but the Python code was still looking for role. So that was throwing errors. So if everything worked well here, then we just added a permission to this user. So let's see if we can see that in the database. Okay, amazing. So because I've added that one permission to our user Mallory, we can now see in the database User with app user ID 4 has permission ID 31. So you might call, Mallory is user 4, so she has that ID 4. And then from our permissions that we were looking at earlier, and then delete comment was permission ID 31. So it looks like that works out how we should expect. That, through this many-to-many table, Django is associating our user Mallory with the ability to delete comments. But fortunately, I don't have to think too hard about the database while I'm writing my code. I just use the user permissions.add and then permission object from the database. But when it comes to debugging, when things aren't working the way you want them to, it's important that you can look through the database and check that things are what you expect them to be. Jesse, do you have a question?
Yeah, do we need to use on line 30 the code name word?
You need to look it up from the database somehow. And
Okay.
they only have 3 properties or 4 properties: ID, name, content type ID, and the code name.
Oh, well, okay, it's just a header name. I see it.
Yeah,
Okay.
you could use the ID, but I don't memorize the IDs for the permissions. So code name is probably the simplest way. Okay, so we have created a permission, but so far it doesn't do anything interesting. So let's actually figure out how we can check these permissions and make them matter. So I'm going to create a new view. I'm going to go to our URLs. So let's say this is just a regular HTML page, Moderators Dashboard. There's a hand up just a second ago.
Yeah, I had a question, Raphael. So I just saw the content type ID corresponds to like one table, as in like one has like all 4 of the categories. If you get the thing by content type ID, like get content ID 1, and then you give that to permissions, does it give them all 4 of those permissions?
You're saying like here, if I search by content type ID.
I think he's saying because the content type ID is 1111, that those
Yeah.
4
They all
all.
You're saying, would that be a good way to give someone 4 permissions at once?
Yeah, because it's access, because the content type ID is pointing all to like one table, right?
Yeah.
You couldn't use that with a get though, because get's only going to return 1 item.
Yeah, you'd have to filter, and then you could filter one.
I want to say that there are other methods to add multiple permissions at once. Oh yeah, so user permission.add, you can just add as many permissions as you want, separated by commas, or you can give it a list of permissions. I don't know if a query set counts as a list for this case, but there's probably some relatively convenient way that you can pass in a list of permissions. So if that's your intention, that like, this user should be able to just do everything, let's say, this user should be able to do everything with blog posts, the full CRUD, then you could say like, yeah, permission objects.get content type ID equals 7, and then just add those permissions in a list all at once. So that's totally something you could do. I was just thinking about adding permissions a la carte, one at a time. But depending on your application's needs, there might be a more efficient way for you to do what you need to do. It's a good question. Any other questions at the moment?
Yeah, can you go through line like 16 to 34 briefly, like quickly, and just state what each line's doing, please?
Okay, so we're trying to sign up a user. So first of all, this URL serves two purposes. If we get a GET request to /signup, we just render the HTML template that is the signup page. If we get a POST request to /signup, we interpret that differently. We assume that someone is sending an AJAX request from the signup page, submitting the signup form, trying to sign up. So the body of their request, the data with their username and password, that's going to be in a JSON string. So we're going to convert that into a dictionary. And then given that we have the user's information, their email and their password, we can create the user in our database. So we're not using the regular create method that most models have, but this is a special method that the Django authentication provides us, create user. So this handles all of the password hashing for us automatically. And then after I've created the user, I want to add their permissions or add some permissions to them. So I'm checking the role that they signed up with. This is again just on the body, but I didn't need the role to create the user. This is for the second step after I've created them. I'm checking specifically if they're a moderator. Then I'll look for the permission with the codename delete comment, because I'm saying in my application, that's what moderators can do. They can delete comments. But that's just a regular object from the database. So this last line here is basically setting up a many-to-many relationship between the user who just registered and the delete comment permission. But Django provides us this handy-dandy method, user permissions.add, which makes it easier to manage the database relationships. Does that help?
Yeah, so every moderator is going to be able to delete comments, right?
Well,
Or no?
they're all going to have the permission delete comments.
Yeah, okay, cool.
So as we're going to find out very soon, the permissions themselves don't actually like mechanically affect the code in any way. Like you have to check for them and write logic. So just like having or not having a permission doesn't like automatically do anything. Were there some other questions I saw? Wow.
Yeah, thank you. So this might be a repetitive question. So it's about when you getting the inputs from the HTML file. So on line 20, oh, sorry. Do you mind go back to the view real quick? So like on line 22, when you use the body equals JSON.loads, so is that kind of relatively same as using request.post at specific input name? Like, can I see it like that?
It's very similar. So the issue is that there are two different ways that form data can be encoded and sent to the server. So for example, normally when you post a form from HTML, it sends it as a, it's called a URL encoded form. It looks kind of like a query string where you see data like this, food equals bar and stuff equals things and time equals now. Whereas when we use Axios, we're sending JSON, which is more like, you know, foo bar, stuff, things, etc. So request.post in Django can only parse URL encoded strings. So that's why I'm just accessing the raw body and then parsing it myself. In the near future, though, we'll be using Django REST framework, which is going to have some smarter assumptions. It's going to be expecting JSON data. And so we're not going to have to do this one step of parsing it manually. But for right now, we'll have to do that. And it's something that comes up from time to time. So you should just generally be aware that JSON is not JavaScript and JSON is not a dictionary. Sometimes you have to convert it back and forth. Sound good?
Also, like, is that let me see. So is there like a specific scenario that we would use request.post like to parsing URL coded text, or if that was the name for it?
Yeah. So if you're doing a traditional form submission, just a regular HTML form, action is whatever method equals post, and you're submitting that without using Axios, without using Ajax. In that situation, you could definitely use request.post. So that was how we were handling post requests in previous weeks. But kind of moving forward, I'm trying to get us more accustomed to building Ajax-based applications. So we're doing things a little bit differently.
Okay, thank you.
Courtney, was your hand up?
Yeah, I think my question got answered in the comments. Thank you.
Cool. Jen?
So was it under in the tables blog app user permissions where you see what permissions the user has after signing in?
Yeah. So here, blog app user permissions. This is just a join table that connects blog app user with auth permission. So if we just star from, all this is saying is that user with the ID 4 has the permission with the ID of 31. This is the only way that we're keeping track of which user has which permission.
Okay.
John, did you have your hand up? Thought I saw you. Or were there any other questions? Guess not. Okay. So we've added this permission to a user. Got this URL for the Moderators Dashboard. So let's make a view for that. And all this is going to do is just render a template. It's going to look very similar to our index.html. I'm not going to have sign up and login buttons because you're already logged in if you're at the dashboard. Okay, great. It doesn't especially matter though what's at the dashboard because the whole point of this demo is to prevent people from getting there. What was the problem? Okay. An underscore instead of a dash. All right, so here there's no, no permissions checking. I just got to go straight in to the dashboard. We need to actually, see who's coming in, validate them a little bit. So before I just, go ahead and render this template, I'm going to check their permission. So if they have the permission, blog.delete comment, then they can go to the moderators dashboard. If not, so if they have the permission, then they get to see the page like normal. If they do not have the permission, we send them an access denied message and a 403 status code. Just means forbidden. It means that they are logged in, but they're not allowed to do the specific action that they're trying to do. So I just want to point out real quick, the syntax is a little bit different when we check for permissions than when we set them. So you have to use the app name and then dot action underscore
Raphael, I got a quick question.
model.
The has perm, where's that coming from?
That is built into Django. That's part of the Django authentication, all the Django authentication app, all of that built-in functionality that Django provides us. Because I've told Django that app user is my user model, it attaches all this extra functionality to the user model, such as has perm, which is able to look through the database and navigate the many-to-many relationship and determine if this user has the delete comment permission for the blog app.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, so I just want to see that print. They have that permission. So we're going to refresh the page. That's not what I was expecting. Oh, I have to return the response. Always got to return the response. Okay. So now I have an access denied error. It's telling me has perm is false. I do not have the permission to delete comments. Well, let's also print out request.user.
How does it know which user if we're not passing in like a user ID or anything?
So request.user is always defined. If no one is logged in, then it's an anonymous user. So let's say, see. So the problem is this property only exists if someone is logged in. So I don't want to throw an error if no one is logged in. What? That's not right. Let's not worry about that for right now. Okay, so I signed up previously with Mallory, who is an administrator or is a moderator, right? So if I log in, Mallory, password is dragons. So I'm logged in now. It looks like that was successful. So now if I go to the Moderators Dashboard, now it lets me in. And so now has perm is telling me true. I guess I never hooked that button up to do anything. Okay, but so if I log out, so I logged out, refresh the page, it's no longer putting my username in the front end because I'm now an anonymous user. I go back to the Moderators Dashboard again. And access denied again with the 403 error because I'm no longer logged in as a moderator. So that's in a nutshell what permissions do, how they work, how you work with them. Although in a lot of cases, this is going to be a lot of manual effort if you're writing these kinds of if-else statements for every route that you write that is only supposed to allow certain users into it. So let's look at maybe a more efficient way that we can accomplish the same thing. I'm going to redefine this Moderators Dashboard. And then we're going to use a piece of middleware called permission required. Does exactly what it sounds like. So basically adding this decorator to this route means that users can only get responses from this route if they have this permission. So all this checking that I was doing in here, if user that has perm, whatever, do this, else, do that. This logic can all be contained with this decorator. So I don't have to put all that checking inside of the route handler itself. So I appreciate that kind of separation of concerns. I think it makes the application a little bit cleaner. But I'm going to need to import this permission required. Let's forget where that comes from. Here we go. Django contrib auth decorators, import permission required. Okay, so now I've commented out my old route, and I've now made a new, much shorter one. But in theory, this should have the same or very similar logic, at least. We'll see in just a second. Okay, so first let's log in as Mallory again. So if I go to the Moderators Dashboard, I can still get in, great. If I log out and try to go back there, we're going to get some kind of strange behavior. So it says page not found, but also it redirects me to accounts/login next equals Moderators Dashboard. So this is the default behavior if you don't tell the decorator what to do for permission failures. Andrew?
Kind of a simple question. what is blog.delete comment? Like, what is blog? Is it just your app name and it's like a property of your app name, or is it a table that it's referencing?
It's the app name, but that is a very good question. I'm not really sure why Django requires you to specify the permissions like this. Because like when we see in the actual table in Postgres, what's actually in the field is just delete comment. And in fact, when we fetch them like here, just straight out of the database like anything else, that's how we refer to them, delete comment. But it's when we're not accessing the database directly, when we're using kind of Django's like helper methods, then they ask you to prefix the app name. So like for has perm, has to be blog.delete comment when you're checking has perm. In the permission required, it's basically the same thing, blog.delete comment. I'm not sure why the syntax is a little bit different here. It seems odd to me, but this is how Django asks you to write it.
How do I know that the delete comment is on the right table?
Like
'Cause,
that's on blog and not something else.
Because like we had like a bunch of different tables, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And delete comment can be like a reference to like any of them, right?
I mean, do you have more than one comments table?
Oh no. I see it. It's the second part of it. Yeah, I was getting confused.
Okay.
Yeah, the comment says it's a comment. For some reason, I thought delete comment was like some regular thing for all of them, and I'm like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no. So yeah, here that the syntax of how you refer to the permissions, app name, action, model. All right, so the default behavior for this permission required decorator, not exactly what we want. So I'm going to change this. So because this is just a regular page load, if their permission is denied, I want to redirect them. So in Django, the way you do that is set a login URL parameter. Now, note, you don't actually have to redirect them to the login page. You can redirect them anywhere you want, but the field is called this argument is called login URL. So the intention is that you redirect them to a page where they can log in because they're supposed to be logged in to do this. But all this really does is redirect them. So you can redirect them wherever you want, whatever you think is appropriate. So let's try this again now. I'm logged out. I try to go to the Moderators Dashboard. And it redirects me to the login page. I want to point out also that Django automatically adds a query string here that indicates where you were trying to go. So it's really cool that Django does this for you automatically. What this is used for is if someone is trying to log in, or if someone is trying to visit a specific page, but they get redirected to the login page because they're not logged in, it's really nice if after they log in, you take them directly to the page they were trying to access instead of just the generic homepage after logging in. So Django is trying to help you out with that a little bit. And so when it redirects people from permissions errors, it'll put a query string indicating where they were trying to get to so that the next page can maybe help them out for them there. Are there a couple questions?
Yeah, I had a question. Are you stuck using the permissions in the permissions table, or could you create your own permissions?
Like your own custom permissions that just say whatever the heck you want?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, you can totally do that. I mean, it's as simple as just creating records in a database, but Django does have some helper methods that make it easy for you. Yeah, so here this person is just, or in the docs, they're just defining custom permissions, a closed task. So you can make up whatever permissions you want. Django is trying to be helpful by creating permissions for each of your models because it just assumes that those are the permissions you need. But you might find that you need to give users permission to do or not do something that doesn't exactly correspond with something in your database. So you can totally make your own.
Okay, and I looked there like where you put the custom permissions is in the model that you want to give permissions for. Like if you wanted to delete posts, you put the permission in the post model.
This is one way to do it. This might be the more organized way actually, but you can also just do it in a single line of code, just like create a new permissions object in the database. Not seeing it here. It's definitely in a different Django documentation article I was reading.
Yeah, I can read more about it like separately. I just wanted to know if it's possible.
Okay, definitely possible. If you can dream it, you can build it.
Cool, thank you.
We had some other questions, a few hands up.
Yeah, thank you. So in your, do you mind go back to the view file real quick? So the login underscore URL, is that like a preset keyword or you can name it whatever you want?
This is a preset keyword. Django and any of these permission required decorators, it is looking for a parameter login URL. And if you don't specify it, it has a default value, which we just showed you. It defaults to a URL that my application doesn't handle. So I'm manually setting this to be a URL that I actually can't handle.
Okay, so you can still modify the second part to whichever templates page you wanted to go to, right?
Yeah. So I just decided that login would be the most sensible option, but I could have them go to the home page instead or somewhere else.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And there was one other question I think I saw. Sean?
Yeah, so can we go back to the Chrome tab real quick? So yeah, you said that Django helps you out by having that on the URL, that query string. How would we have I guess access to that to link it to that? So when you log in, that's where you go. How would you go implementing that?
So in the login handler, so request.post, yada, yada, yada. So at this point, they are logged in. And then, what do you think here? So it's a little different because we're using Ajax here, but if we were not using Ajax, say next equals get. So just get that next parameter from the query string, and then just that, basically.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Were there any other questions? Are you ready to continue? All right. So that's one way that we can use this permission required decorator, but this is mostly appropriate for traditional page requests where we would render a template. If we want to have an Ajax request, an Ajax route that we protect, we might approach that a little bit differently. So I'm going to make another view here for delete comments. We're going to imagine that this is intended for Ajax. Okay, so it doesn't actually do anything super interesting, but we're just trying to see if we can forbid people from accessing this route. So I'm just gonna do this right from the index. Why not? So just on page load, we're going to axios.get the comments. Okay, so a slightly different situation here. We're sending an AJAX request from the home page. All right, so we're getting the results back, success true, because I haven't protected it with anything. Let's see if I just try copy pasting this permission required here. So now it doesn't really work quite as well. So I sent the request with AJAX and I got a permission denied error. And then the server tries to redirect me, but that just means that the response I get is this other HTML page for the index where it's trying to redirect me to. So for an AJAX request, this is not particularly useful. Also, it gives a 200 status code because yeah, it successfully loaded the index page, but it didn't successfully, process my request. So slightly different way I'm going to handle this here. Instead of login URL, I'm going to pass raise exception equals true. So in this case, the server is not going to try to gracefully handle the error and like redirect them somewhere else. It's just going to send an error and be like, yeah, you messed up, try again, or log in, or just try to be more important and have more permission. So now we're getting a 403 error, which is the intention. This is what I was looking to see here, because this user is not logged in right now. We don't see anyone's name. I don't have a currently authenticated user. Sending a request to a route that should require a specific user permission. I don't have it. And so the server responds with a 403 error. So going forward, I think that this form is going to be a little bit more useful to you all, as you're going to be building mostly AJAX-based applications as we're working with React. All right, so that's about all I've got to say about permissions, but let's talk about groups in just a second. Does anyone have any more questions about permissions or what we've talked about so far?
Can you just do like a recap of the highlights of what you think is important to know about them?
Django automatically creates 4 permissions for every model in your database. There's another table that creates a many relationship between those permissions and your users. Although just being associated with a permission doesn't actually allow your users to do or not do anything by default. You have to write code that checks those permissions. So like request.user.hasPerm is checking a specific permission in the database and then has other logic that flows based on that. Permission required is basically the same thing as user.hasPerm, just with some extra logic and it's more concise. Yeah, the permissions don't really do a whole lot like built in. It's just that Django creates them for you automatically and is able to check them easily. But a lot of the logic you have to write yourself. Does that help? Or is there any follow-up question I can answer?
Yeah, the GET requests that you did for delete comments, what did it look like again on your main.js?
Pretty simple.
Oh, just logging the response. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Can you go back to the views.py real quick? So when you change the login URL to the raise exception, what was it? I guess, is it because you wanted it to throw up a 403 instead of having that status code 200? Because that was the only difference, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Because a redirect is not meaningful to the client. If like you redirect an AJAX request, it doesn't automatically move the client to a different page. It just returns HTML in the response to Axios, which is not super useful. It would be better to just send an error message, because then from Axios, we can, we can handle that. Say, if something like this. This is kind of pseudocode, but
Then you can do something.
Something like that.
Cool.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about groups. So everything I showed you about permissions is like the basic mechanics of how you can let people or not let them do things. But practically speaking, you don't want to actually assign permissions to individual users, because that gets kind of messy, just managing all these permissions for every individual user and making sure that everyone can only do the things they're supposed to be able to do and not do the things they're not supposed to be able to do. So a concept in permissions management, which if any of you took your AWS Cloud Practitioner cert exam, you might have been exposed to this concept. But oftentimes people will prefer to define permissions on groups instead of on users, and then add users to groups. Lyman, do you have a question?
Yeah, so before we get to this next part, what do you think about us taking a little quick break?
Yeah, let's take a quick break. Why don't we come back at 11:35?
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So just like we showed you, it's possible to manage individual permissions per user, but that's kind of messy. More commonly, what you'll want to do is define groups for users that define, what all those users in that group can do, and then you'll just add users to the group. So this is again stored in our database in Postgres. Looking at all of our tables, got a table here, auth group. It exists, but it's pretty simple. It just has an ID and a name, and there's no records. So we don't start out with any groups by default. We have to make all the groups that we're going to use in Django. And all they do is have a name. So it just kind of lets us associate users together. And then also, we're going to be thinking about auth group permissions. Which again is a join table that just connects a group with a permission. So just, what can the members of this group do? Pretty similar to the join table we saw before, connecting our users with permissions, but this just connects permissions to groups instead. So let's try to modify our application so it uses groups instead of just applying permissions to users individually. So here in my view, if the user is a moderator, previously we're just attaching this permission directly to the user. Now we still want to access this permission because this is the permission we want to give to the user, but instead of giving it to them directly, we're not going to do user.userPermissions.add permission. But first we're going to create a group. So now I'm doing this in signup. So the first time this code runs, we're going to have to create a group. But on subsequent signups, I would rather just use the group that already exists. So there's a really convenient function in Django that'll do either of those as needed. we need to import group. So again, group is just another model from the Django auth app. So it comes from the same place as permission. So here's the code now for basically building the same application, but just using groups instead of individual user permissions. So when someone signs up, I'm first accessing the moderators group or creating it if it doesn't exist. So this is kind of an interesting function. Group objects get or create. So it'll first look for a group in our database that has the name moderators. And if it does, it returns it. If that record does not exist, then it creates it and then returns it. The one thing that's particularly odd about this function is that it returns two values in a tuple. And commonly, this is what I've seen when people want to get the return value, is they just assign it to two variables like this. So a lot of times when you're calling these kinds of like get or create functions, you don't really care if the thing was created for the first time right then, or if you just accessed an already created version, but maybe sometimes you do. So that's what this second variable is for. This will just return true or false if we actually had to create a new group when we ran this line of code, or if the moderators group already existed. I don't particularly care, but the function does return two values. So I need to be prepared to receive both of those. All right, so now I'm going to try to register a new user. So they should be added to the moderators group, but that should still have the same permissions. All right, so here we are on the home page. I'm going to sign up. Why not Alice? So it's dragons. Her role is moderator. And we submit. So we signed up, we got redirected to the home page. And we got some permission denied errors from the delete comments route. So I was kind of expecting that. That's fine. So now we actually have to log in. So I'm going to mix this up a little bit here. We're going to go back to our moderators dashboard here. So this is the previous example with just request IUser.hasPerm. Logged in as Alice. Excuse me. Let's take a look at this in the database real quick. Okay, yeah, auth group permissions, group 1 has permission 31. Okay, so I've created my auth group, these moderators. Then blog app user groups. Does Alice belong to this group? No, okay. So it's like I did not successfully add anyone to the group. What is going on here? Oh, hold up. So it looks like I just
created
pardon.
in the permissions. Okay, you're just adding the permission. Okay, never mind. So I was looking
Yeah.
at-
Go ahead.
No, I was just looking at your the moderators group .permissions.add. For a minute, I see it's .permissions. I was thinking if that was what you're using to add into the group. That's just the permissions. Never mind.
So I did forget a step here. I've created the group. I've added the permission to the group, but I've not actually added the user to the group. So that's an important part here. And that's what we saw in the database, that the group itself was set up, except that nobody belonged to it.
I have a question regarding like the design choice here. So do you always like create the like the permissions and the groups in the views.py?
No, this is more just for like a really quick kind of demo and just showing you that you can create them programmatically. I think maybe like going forward, if you have a well-planned application and you kind of know what you want to build, maybe you would just put the groups in like fixtures. Because, well, it depends. So this is getting ahead of myself a little bit, but there are a couple reasons why you might create groups. So what I'm showing you here is just using groups to replace user permissions. And it's just kind of a slightly more organized way of doing the same thing. And in that case, like you're probably not going to create those dynamically. It might make sense to just set them all up in fixtures because those don't change in response to user actions. It's just based on the models in your database. But another reason why you might use groups is to group users together in an organization. So, like imagine in GitHub or whatever, you can be an administrator on GitHub and it gives you access to like delete repos, but not anyone's repos, just your repos. So, and then also like payment details are often like done by group instead of by individual users. So there are other reasons why you would use groups. But if you're using groups in that way for an organization, you would have to create them on sign up, kind of like what I'm doing here, because there's no way they could exist beforehand.
Okay. And then for like individual users, and if you want to grant them permissions or give them permissions, is that usually always done like on sign up as well? Or where would you usually create those permissions?
I mean, more practically, probably like one person, like, the CEO of your company or whatever, or your manager or whatever, is going to sign up for an application with an administrator account, with like a paid account. So because they, supply their credit card, they get to be the admin for the organization that they create. And so that creates a group. And then that one user would probably have privileges to change the permissions for other users in their group. So it wouldn't be set like on sign up, but probably like the admins for the group have some dashboard that lets them change permissions for other users within that group. But that would be a whole lot of engineering for me to set that up here.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
And actually, that might be a pretty good use case for using the Django admin backend. If you have just like, well, maybe not. No, you'd probably still want to design that by hand, I think. Never mind. But yeah, so there's a few different reasons why you'd use groups, and you would create them at different times depending on what they're being used for. So I'm going to create another user now so they can actually be added to the group. Let's get rid of this for now. So this is going to be moderator, dragons, role is moderator, sign up, log in. Okay, we're logged in as Mr. Moderator now. So now, if I look at the blog app user groups table, there's now one record in it. The person with the user ID of 6 is in group number 1. I'm pretty sure this is the 6th user that I've created in this demo, so that sounds correct to me. Let's see what happens if I try to go to Moderators Dashboard. Everything works exactly the same way. So I didn't have to change any of the code that checks the permissions. Where is that? In the Moderators Dashboard, I didn't have to change any of the code that checks permissions, even though now the permission no longer exists on the user, but it exists on the user's group instead. So that is part of the value that has perm provides you. This is kind of part of the magic that it gives you, is that it doesn't just look for the permission on the user itself, but it'll also check all of the groups that the user belongs to and then see if any of those groups have that permission. So if the user has been granted the permission from anywhere, from himself or from any group that they're in, then they'll have that permission and user.hasPerm will return true. So I think that's really nice. It's a very elegant kind of system. You can kind of think of it a little bit like inheritance, that like the user themselves might not have a permission, but a group they belong to might have that permission. And I think it only goes one level. Like I don't think you can have groups of groups in Django. I could be mistaken. Apparently no. Okay, so you cannot have groups inside of groups. I'm sorry, hang on just 5 seconds. Sorry, I have cats and sometimes they get a little bit ridiculous. Okay. So if we use the decorator version, it should still work the same way. So yeah, I'm refreshing the page. I'm still able to access this protected page, because whether I'm using the permission required decorator or just user.hasPerm, it still will check the group permissions if the user themselves does not have the permission you're looking for. So typically, you're going to want to manage the permissions for users and groups. Even if there's only one user that has a given permission, I would still create a group just for that one user and then add them to that group. And then one last little thing I want to show you can be useful. So one other decorator that you might want to use called user passes test. This is kind of similar to permission required, but it's more generic. Permission required will just check if the user has a given permission. User passes test lets you write your own function that just checks the user for anything. So I'm going to make a new route. So I'm going to rewrite this route actually. Instead of using permission required, we're going to use user passes test, where we're going to try to achieve the same functionality. But instead of checking if the user has the permission for delete comment, we're going to check if they belong to the moderators group. It's kind of functionally the same thing. I just want to show you how to use this user passes test decorator. So I call or use user passes test, pass it a function. This function is going to get the user passed in automatically. So user.groups is going to return an empty list, even if there are no groups found, if the user doesn't belong to the moderators group. And so this exists function should return true or false if it's a non-empty list, basically. So now again, when I try to access the moderators dashboard, it should call this function. And then if it returns true, then it continues on, processes it as normal. But if it returns false, then the user is denied. Yeah, so I can go to the moderators dashboard again. It still works. I'm still allowed in. You can see the print statement here is this user moderator. It's got to run this decorator every time we load the page so it can check that user who's trying to access it. So this example is pretty trivial because it's just looking to see if they belong to a group. And typically, if you want to know if someone belongs to a group to check a permission, you could just check the permission. But this is more useful for like organizations, I guess. Like if you want to make sure that someone is only editing data that belongs to their organization, like I'm only modifying Quebec Platoon's GitHub repos. I'm not modifying Facebook's GitHub repos. I think a good way to check for that would be user passes test with checking for the specific group name, because it's not like there's a specific permission you're looking for, but it's really just membership in that group itself is what you want to know to see if you're modifying your own data or data that doesn't belong to you. So for tonight's homework, it's going to be all about preventing users from accessing certain pages. So for much of it, you can probably just use permission required, or because of the example, well, the homework is actually pretty generic and might be kind of simple. So it might be easier to actually use user passes test and just check for exactly what you want. Like some of the requirements are, Alice can go to this page, Bob cannot go to that page. It's going to be very specific. There are going to be a few groups of people, but user passes test might be useful tonight. But generally, you can use any of the tools that I've showed you today to try to attempt the homework. It's fairly open-ended. We've got about 3 minutes left. What questions do we have? Anybody? Questions? Going once, going twice? I know you all are real curious about this.
I think we just got to get into it and then the questions will come.
All right, let's get into it then. So not pair programming today. You're gonna have the Beyond Tech at 4:30. So there's no stand down. Yeah, that's it for today then. And actually that's it for this week. So enjoy your weekend. Take care, everybody.